Kelton Hatch scheduled in hour number two today from Idaho Fish and Game, our monthly update. And if you have a comment or question, remember, Kelton is available to take your telephone calls. Item number two, Top Story with Bill Colley is the name of the show. The top story today, of course, is the effort to bring down Donald Trump by the fellow travelers in the Democrat Party and mainstream media. And we're going to spend most of the time in the first hour talking about that. But to try and head off at the pass, any callers who are going to chime in and completely derail that conversation about 15 minutes in saying, "Yeah, Bill, did you hear Roger Ailes died?" Yes, we know because we're a Fox News affiliate. We've heard it a couple of times on the news already. And he was a man who was very important in his job at his company. And it's a shame to see that he's died, but he led a good life. He's 77 years old. That's probably likely more than I'll ever get. And it was popping up on the AP wires, which we have here at every desk in the office. And let's see. Oh, and on my cell phone from every source that is possible out there that I get alerts from. So, yes, we know we don't need to have interrupters calling today and getting us off topic and say, "What are you talking about? I just tuned in. Did you know Roger died?" We're not talking about that today because there's a much bigger story going on, and that is Robert Mueller, former director of the FBI, brought in. They're not calling him special prosecutor. The word prosecutor is not being used. He has been brought in to look at the allegations that Donald Trump was in collusion, or at least his campaign, with the Russians during the course of last year's election. And a lot of chatter in Washington from the left that Donald Trump will not survive. Bookmakers in the United Kingdom are claiming Trump is going to be impeached, and they're laying odds on money that that's going to happen. And yet, the saner voices that are coming out of Washington, the people who actually think about these things and go into some depth about them, have a slightly different take. Have you ever seen this fellow, Jonathan Turley? He's a professor of constitutional law at George Washington University in the nation's capital. He has admitted he twice voted for president for Barack Obama. In other words, he is probably more left-leaning than he would be right-leaning. And yet last night he was appearing on The Story with Martha McCallum. I believe it was on The Story with Martha McCallum on the Fox News channel. And he said that you've got this guy in who's actually got very broad powers now to investigate what's going on. In fact, I went and I read the wording of his job title today, and that's true. He can be looking at Trump's associates and at the Trump campaign and going through all of those records. But he also, while he's looking at those, if he comes across other things, maybe even involving Democrats, he can delve into those too as well. And Turley was warning his fellow liberals last night while he was appearing on McCallum's show that this might not be a good idea. It's something called the boomerang effect.
The other thing I would note is when you're investigating the Russians, people ought to be a little cautious. You know, a special counsel is like a live torpedo in the water. It can hit anything. And this city is awash with Russian money. There's a lot of Democrats as well as Republicans that have been hired by Russian outfits and extensions of Moscow. This is a sort of a cottage industry in this town. People should be very careful when they ask for a broad scope, because you wouldn't be able to say for certain who would fall under it.
Now, I read the president's statement last night where he said he welcomes the investigation and that this will clear everything up. I have been reading the pros and cons since last night on this. Some of the folks who actually write about these things think it's a good idea and agree with the president. And the thinking there is there's nothing to see here, and when it's done, you'll be able to turn around and look at the Democrats and say, you just wasted all that time and the money of the U.S. taxpayers to go chasing after something that wasn't there for your own political opportunism, which means it will benefit Trump in that situation. He'll also be able to turn around, look at the media, and say, these purveyors of fake news were involved in this effort, and they have wasted your tax dollars too, because they clamored for this. So Trump, in one view of all of this, is going to come out of this looking really, really good. The trouble is, and I think that a lot of people are aware of this, the Senate was nearly done with its investigation, and the Democrats had been invited to take part. And the Senate was very close to wrapping this up. And the Senate was going to issue a report that said, there's nothing to see here. So we were nearly done with all of this. It was nearly over. And that report would have come out and probably disappointed folks on the left, but it would have ended all of this. By having a special, and again, he's not being called a prosecutor, he'll be an investigator, but by having this man go delve into this, this could stretch out for years, which means the Democrats are very happy because even though in the long run it may reelect Donald Trump by 2020, who'll be able to point at this and say it was a witch hunt and a wild goose chase. In the meantime, the interim in 2018, if the investigation is still open with the midterm elections coming along, the Democrats could make some hay with this. So there's your double-edged sword. Now, I don't know that Donald Trump, and I hate to say this because he's not necessarily been a loyal Republican, he's certainly not a conservative Republican, he may not care if somebody out in a congressional district in the middle of Waukegan gets defeated next year by a Democrat. It may not bother him because he may feel that he's Mr. Compromise, that he can work with everybody. But there's the downside to all of this. It's 8:12. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. But gosh, we're at 35 right now and a lot of fog this morning. If you're outside, you'll notice that. We went from a few snow flurries yesterday morning. I even saw a few scattered flurries driving home from work yesterday afternoon. And it turned to rain very quickly, and then it didn't rain very long. But we're going from scattered flurries yesterday to fog today to temperatures by the middle of next week in the middle 80s. God likes to play dice with the weather, I suppose. Even though, what was it? Einstein said he didn't play dice, but he's likely testing us for some longer term project he's got in mind, of which we know not. Speaking of the weather is a service of Mountain Home Auto Ranch in Mountain Home. Reason Magazine, which is it's probably the leading libertarian publication in Washington. Libertarian is not liberal. Libertarians, well, a good explanation and tongue-in-cheek I once heard about libertarians was they're a lot like conservatives, except they believe that dope should be legalized. But there's a writer there named Nick Gillespie. And I wondered when I was reading this, I think about these hard-hitting things, if somebody ran over to Gillespie while he was writing this and they spun him around in his chair several times, would he be dizzy, Gillespie? Anyway, he says, let's get real. At this point in the game, all the explainers about how impeachment works and adapting the 25th Amendment's ability to remove the president from decision-making during colonoscopies to the current crisis are evidence-free exercises in ideological, and then he uses a word here for self-abuse. And he says, if we're going to survive not just the Trump years, but eventually get around to kickstarting the 21st century, we're going to have to become smarter media consumers and demand more from both our politicians and the press. The New York Times has not viewed a copy of the memo. That comes from the Times. The New York Times, talking about the Comey memo, stated that the paper had not viewed a copy of the memo. Quote, but one of Mr. Comey's associates read parts of it to a Times reporter, unquote. And Mr. Gillespie says, as Reason Scott Shackford has noted, that's what Joe Biden would call a big deal. If it turns out to exist and be accurate, it's also a pretty big if at this point. But even before Mr. Comey's possible paper trail, documenting the president's demands, which may or may not actually rise to the level of an impeachable offense, his enemies were out in force. That would be the president's enemies. For God's sake, the writer says, they wanted him impeached even before he was the Republican nominee. Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Considerably more discussion about this. Joe Scarborough, who used to be a relatively conservative Republican member of the House of Representatives in the 1990s, and then walked over to the dark side and started working with MSDNC's Morning Joe. The show's named after him. And his co-host, Mika Brzezinski, the two of them left their spouses so they could be together. She's the daughter of the very liberal Zbigniew Brzezinski, who gave Iran to the mullahs, to the mad mullahs under the Carter regime. And he presided over the giving away of the Panama Canal and a number of other things. So she has quite the pedigree, too, as well. But Joe Scarborough was appearing with, I think it was Angus King, who was a senator from the state of Maine. And King is a fairly stand-up guy, and Joe suddenly lost it. Whatever conservatism he had 20 years ago occasionally still seeps through. I want you to take a listen to this because I think perhaps a few people, even at the most liberal media outlets, they're sometimes sitting back and they're letting the rhetoric pass by, and then they're saying, you know what, this is this is not really a good idea.
Slow down and take a deep breath, because a lot of people are, a lot of respected people across the political spectrum have started using the word impeachment. Doesn't that at the end just play into the narrative that Donald Trump and his supporters would want, which is the media and the political establishment is overreacting and hyperventilating and being too aggressive in their charges against Trump?
And then we have Andrew Napolitano writing his column at the Washington Times today, who refers to this as 7 Days in May. If you recall the movie, based on a book, the movie way back in the 1960s with Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas, was about the attempted coup by the military to take over the presidency and subvert the president of the United States. And this is what the deep state, according to Andrew Napolitano, is at work doing here with media collusion. The question you have to ask then, if they don't succeed and they build Donald Trump even bigger, is that exactly what media and liberals want? We've got a caller with us. Caller, you're up next, and you're on KLIX.
Good morning.
Sure, go ahead. Good morning to you. Happy Thursday.
If we had Donald Trump actually get impeached, what are the chances that that would set off the economic collapse on Wall Street and just basically an outcry of the public and its contingents and basically set up a basic realistic civil war? I mean, what's the reality of that? I'll listen off air. Thank you.
Thank you. If you're familiar with the name John Batchelor, and I believe one of the stations to our east down the highway carries his program. John Batchelor is a syndicated talk show host. He had a piece about this yesterday where he reviewed the language, just the language that was used in Rome that led to a couple of civil wars there. And then the language that led to the Civil War in England that, brought along, got rid of the king lost his head. And then our own Civil War, the language, and he says it's all very similar right now. And yes, Wall Street is flinching from all of this, but the rhetoric on both sides is pretty heated right now. And I think Batchelor was right on point. What's happening today is almost identical to what we saw coming out of the mouths in our own Civil War and in the British Civil War, or English Civil War at the time, and in a couple of Roman Civil Wars. And that alone should be concerning to people. But on the other hand, as bad as I think that would be, if it would purge America of its evil elements, well, every once in a while, was it Jefferson said, the tree of liberty? I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting, but, it had to be refreshed with the blood of patriots. I do know this, and I know it well, and I think most of you do too. Most of your patriots are Republicans and conservatives, and they know how to handle firearms, and that's the decider in any civil war. I'd hope to get an old friend on the show today to speak about the direction that media is taking us with all of this. He is probably the greatest newsman I've ever known, and he retired about a year and a half ago after 45 years or so in the business from KMOX radio in St. Louis, which at the time was the most listened to radio station in the country, and he ran the newsroom there for 21 years with a background in radio and television. And actually, to tell you how modern media works, I'll say something to you, and then I'll have to give you the context, because the problem with modern media is so often you get just half the story, so media can further a narrative that it wants. If I told you that my friend John used to throw Viet Cong out of helicopters, you'd say, oh, what a terrible man, what a terrible individual. And that's what happens with modern media today. You get about half the story, but actually when John was working psychological operations during the Vietnam War, if they captured some VC prisoners, they would blindfold them. They'd climb into a helicopter, and then the helicopter would just, zoom around a few feet off the ground, back and forth. So it's simulated, if you've got a blindfold on, that you're flying high in the sky. And what they would do is after they'd be about 2 feet off the ground hovering, and then they'd throw one of these guys out the door, and everyone would start talking. No one would get hurt. So it was very effective. But you have to put that in context because the first statement makes him sound like he's this terrible war criminal. But it shows you that media operates in that way. And John, who was the straightest of all news people I ever met, and I worked for him for about 6 years. And I remember no matter where I'd go, I'd have people tell me, politicians especially, that we were the fairest news organization they dealt with. And yet on staff, we had a managing editor who was a flaming liberal in his personal life. And even around the newsroom, he'd spot liberalism. But we had a morning editor who was also our morning news anchor who was a bedrock conservative. And yet none of it ever influenced the news. It was just we were all so busy. We were all trying to do our job, just get information out there so people could lead their lives, things that we thought they should know, but we weren't trying to tell them what they needed to think. And I emailed John last night and said, could you spend some time with us on the air? And I was unfortunately unable to make contact. Now that he's retired, he travels a lot, so I don't know that he's had an opportunity to see the message or not. But he would be a fascinating individual if we could actually get his take on this. And if not today, maybe sometime in the next couple of weeks. Speaking of time, there may still be time if you haven't yet done it, and yet you'd also like to learn a little bit more about some of the advances in hearing health. There is a luncheon today, and it's also a seminar at the Minnecasia Chamber of Commerce in Hayburn. It starts at noon. Dr. Christine Pickup from Mount Harrison Audiology in Rupert. She's going to be sharing information on hearing health, brain health, and current technology advances. And I know we're down to the wire here, but if you probably got on the horn with her office in the next few minutes, you might still be able to make it. It's 208-312-0957. That's 208-312-0957. It's 8:26. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. I wanted to point out Kelton Hatch will join us in hour number 2 of the show today from Idaho Fish and Game. If you've got a question or comment, it'd be interesting to know with all of the water now spilling out of the mountains exactly what the fishing conditions are like. We've got to talk to him a little bit about that. In the meantime, I just referenced my friend John and his service to his country during the war in Southeast Asia. Speaking of people who've actually served in the military, this is a little long, but I wanted to share it before the break. This guy is Carl Higbie. He was a Navy SEAL. He was speaking on CNN about this whole Trump controversy, battling 2 former Clinton staffers and a fellow traveler who was anchoring the show about the Russia collusion story.
So I'm sitting here very quietly listening to all this BS, quite frankly. And did you listen to anything McMaster said today where he said, I was in the room, that didn't happen, nothing inappropriate was shared? You're basing all these allegations off of 1 or maybe 2 sources, which CNN reports. 2 former officials knowledgeable of the situation confirmed to CNN the main points of the story. 2 former officials. Tell you what, come out, name those people, then we'll have something to talk about.
1, we protect sources. 2, it's not just CNN, it's Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN, ABC,
yeah, but who
NBC.
Who are the sources?
Carl.
Who are the sources? Oh, because they're hiding behind this anonymity.
Oh,
and that's what we're seeing.
Please, do not even start with me that you're just going to attack sources.
Okay, so
that
what about,
is ridiculous.
So are you saying McMaster is lying?
I'm not saying McMaster is lying.
Well, he didn't really answer the question.
He didn't answer the question.
He said nothing inappropriate was shared.
He said, no, that's his opinion.
That would be...
But that's his opinion.
You cannot attack, do not attack the stellar reporters of CNN who have their sources and would protect their
stellar reporters of CNN that I am going to attack right now and say, guess what? I don't believe them because they're staying anonymous. If they stand behind this story, come out, face the camera.
Can I just say something?
All they've been doing is facing the camera, Carl.
The people who are in that room?
We have anonymous sources. We protect them for real reasons. So the information that is important to the public can get out.
Happen? I mean, those were anonymous sources. Was that not a real story?
I'm saying that there's been so many anonymous sources.
But seriously, so Watergate, it was all a lie because it was anonymous sources.
It was a trial.
Right. But
Carl, you're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing yourself, your party, and your country. You should not be doing this. You're a better person than this. I'm ashamed for you. This is not the discussion we should be having. This is a serious moment in our country's history. The President of the United States has been accused of and has admitted to sharing highly sensitive information to the Russian government. To not only the Russian government, but to a known Russian spy,
Let's deal with the facts. H.R. McMaster today confirmed when he was speaking to reporters that that Trump's aides, after the meeting, went to the NSA and the CIA to ask about classification of information that Donald Trump discussed. If there was no problem with what Donald Trump discussed, why was Tom Bossert going to speak to the NSA and the CIA afterward?
Well, since you so nicely pointed out that I do understand classified material, after a lot of these briefings, there are a lot of calls over to NSA, to the DOD, to find out if anything was classified beyond what they talked about. So guess what? These calls happen almost every single
H.R.
time.
McMaster says, I don't really know why.
So these calls sometimes happen after a lot of these meetings. So guess what? I still don't believe, I think this is a complete witch hunt.
There you go. You got the former Clinton staffers and the Clinton News Network telling a former Navy SEAL that he's embarrassing himself and he should be ashamed. I loathe the military. So does Hillary. 8:30. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. That's the way to treat a true American hero. We're at 38 on our way into the mid-50s today.